Have you ever suffered from the terrible disease called comparavirus? There's this virus that seems to spread, and it's been around for as long as humans have been alive. There's this virus that goes that people look upon one another and they compare themselves to one another. And it often manifests itself with jealousy or bitterness or hatred or even self-loathing. We see this with siblings, for example. Children will compare themselves to their other siblings and wonder about the justice or fairness of their parents. Why did he get to use a knife at 8 when I had to wait till I was 10 to have my own jackknife? Or as children divide the estate of a parent who's passed away, they begin to wonder, how come they got a little bit more than I got? We do this comparing in social media. We curate our lives and we put up pictures, and we find that other people have wonderful, amazing lives, and we look at the pictures that they post and we think, I didn't get that wonderful vacation. I didn't get to do those amazing things. How is it that they have such an amazing life? Because we've curated our lives in such a way that we post what's the best about ourselves, and it creates this disappointment or a lack of satisfaction. Or people will compare themselves to others with respect to their vocations. A father will look at what other fathers are doing and compare how he falls short or how he's inadequate. Or a mother might think that she should be super mom and be baking bread and doing all these amazing crafts and teaching all of her children these skills. Or we do it in our workplaces where we look at other businesses and we think that the outcome that they had we can replicate. That if we just do what they've done, that we could replicate the same kinds of successes. And churches do this too, pastors and ministries, that there is this temptation to compare, that I am going to be like them, because the comparison is, if I do what they do, there will be some sort of similar outcome. We all want this sense of equity. We want things to be fair. We want things to be treated like it's proper. And yet, at the same time as we want equity, we also want to be treated uniquely. Because we don't want to be treated exactly as the other person. We want to be treated as our personalities and our strengths and weaknesses can accommodate those things. And so we want equity, but we want to be unique. There are many temptations that come with this comparavirus. It's not that comparing is in itself sinful, but there is a unique set of temptations that come along with comparing. It's been around since Cain and Abel and their offering of sacrifices in Genesis 4. It's here in John 21, and it exists in the heart of every human being who looks upon another person wondering, what about them? What is it? What is it about comparing that becomes so dangerous? There's good comparing and there's bad comparing. What do we have to be aware of? Jesus says, the first thing I want us to see is, Jesus says, what is that to you? Here, Peter has been publicly restored to ministry. He's been reinstated to his apostolic task. Feed my sheep, Jesus says to him. And now with this task, as Peter has this responsibility, Jesus begins to outline to Peter, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and you used to go your own way, but when you're old, you will be dressed. And he is predicting and foretelling Peter that he will die as an old man and that he will die an excruciating death. And as Peter hears these words, it must have done something quite profound to him. Could you imagine being told, you're going to live a long time, and the end of your life is going to be that you're crucified? Now, carry on. There's a sense in which there could be this looming dread, this wondering. What will this look like? I could live in fear the rest of my life, being paralyzed, uncertain as to what each day would hold. But look at what Peter does when Jesus tells him that he will die an old man and he will die as one who is crucified. What does Peter do? He has this sick response that so many of us have. What about that man? Peter, who has just denied the Lord 3 times, who has been reinstated by Jesus with 3 times, 3 confessions. What does he do? In light of all of the mercy, all of the grace, all of the kindness that Jesus has shown to him, what does he do? He has this sick response of comparing. What about this man? He looks at John, the author of this gospel, the beloved disciple, the one who leaned against Jesus at the table, the one who had this close intimacy. And he looks at him with this eye. What about this man? There is a temptation that comes with comparing, and there is a unique temptation that when we face suffering, to compare ourselves to others. It's not just that we compare other people's successes, but when we hear of the very unique challenges that we face or we're going through trials, there is a sense in which we can be like the psalmist in Psalm 73 and ask the question, why do the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper? My foot had almost slipped, said the psalmist. And we can look at another situation when we're going through hard times, and we can wonder about the fairness of God, the goodness of God. Why do I have to go through this? Why am I going to suffer? Peter could have easily asked the question, why do I have to live till I'm old and have the knowledge of a terrifying death at the end of my life and have to bear that for the rest of my days? It can fill us with this sense of, is God truly fair? Is God just? It can lead to a bitterness about other people's successes. It can lead us to question their privileged status. Most likely, Peter is asking about John because, as John records, he's had this beloved disciple relationship with Jesus. He's been the one who's been close to Jesus, the one leaning on Jesus' chest as they're at that Last Supper, the intimacy that they shared. And Peter, I could well imagine, though the text doesn't say this, I could well imagine that Peter's looking at him going, why does he get the better ride? Why is life better for him? And it can create a bitterness. It can create an envy, create a jealousy, which can even grow into a hatred. That we can despise someone else's success or well-being and wish them that they would suffer harm, because if I have to suffer this, why can't they? And ultimately, it can lead to a self-loathing or self-hatred. Why is my life this way? Has God forgotten me? Is my life worth living? Is it worth comparing then? The disciples, you see, they speculate about John as Jesus says to them, if it is my will that John remain until I come, what's that to you? And so the speculation begins among the disciples, we're told in verse 23. So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die. They've got this whole narrative that they're building up. They've got these expectations that are totally blown out of proportion. Their mind has gone down a track, and they can only envision these things as Jesus saying, this disciple's going to live until Jesus returns. And so the temptation of sinful comparison is that we can think we all deserve equity, but I want to be treated equally. And while I want to be treated equally, I also want to be treated uniquely. which then destroys this idea of total equity. What's the cure to this comparavirus? How are we then to rightfully live? The right response then is, you follow Jesus. There is good news when Jesus says to Peter, you follow me. It's intended, these words, to root your individual identity and my individual identity in Jesus Christ, to ground ourselves in our union with Him, so that we, being united with Christ, would find that our identity, our value, our worth is not in what we own or in what we have or in what we give or even in how we are treated, but that we are valued and beloved by Jesus, because Jesus does not compare us to others. Jesus has no ranking as to, well, these are more special disciples and these are less special disciples. That while He has a disciple that He truly, dearly loves in John, and while He has an inner circle, He has a unique plan of discipleship for every single follower of Him. That the path of discipleship that Jesus calls Peter to, and the path of discipleship that He calls John to, are similar paths, and yet they have very unique flavors, if you would. That the path of discipleship has to take into account the different personalities, the strengths, the weaknesses, the temptations, the struggles, the circumstances. From personality to where you live and who you are, Jesus has factored all of these things into His unique plan of discipleship for you. And that's good news, because in His uniqueness, in His plan for discipleship, it means that He has a plan to grow you to be like Him. And in that, there are many similarities. He's given us the same word, the same commands, the same gospel to trust. There are similar tasks that we are called to do. And yet He has gifted us uniquely, given us unique strengths, unique vulnerabilities, so that each one of us will have to trust Him. For the person who is very boastful, there will be one path that Jesus has to tenderly work to make that person more like Jesus. And for the worried personality, another set of circumstances that will form them into the very person that Jesus has intended them to become. And that's good news, that He doesn't treat us exactly the same way. That the unique temptations, he has styled and structured a discipleship plan for you and for me so that we might grow. That there is no one-size discipleship that fits all. That there is a discipleship plan that Jesus has for you. Because Jesus doesn't ask you to live someone else's life. He asks you to live your life. And His plan for your life is unique, though with many similarities to others. He has designed this for you. This is why the Apostle Paul, he can say in Philippians 2, he can say these words. He can say, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for His good pleasure." Work out your own salvation, not someone else's. And the reason that Jesus has this unique discipleship plan for you is that while it's unique, it's intended to draw you to Him and connect you to others. So a unique discipleship plan, lest we get this idea that Jesus has a unique plan for me, therefore I don't need other believers. That's not how Jesus' discipleship plan works. The unique plan of Jesus' discipleship is that as He calls you to Himself, He's calling others. Imagine a mother duck, if you would. She's got all these ducklings, and they're swimming about and scattering. And if you've ever seen a mother duck, all of a sudden, when she calls her little ducklings, all of a sudden they go from these scattered positions, and they all come to her. And as she begins to swim off, they all get into line. And in a similar way, Jesus calls us, each one of us, from our unique circumstances, but he calls him to himself, which means that we are all being drawn in a similar direction to him, that we would follow him, that we would trust him, that we would be aligned with him, and in aligning with him, we will be aligning with one another. It doesn't mean that our uniqueness is sacrificed, but rather that we're pulling together, coming to the Lord Jesus. But Jesus here is saying, Peter, what is that to you? What I'm going to do with John? What's that to you? Only you follow me. But this is the end of the Gospel of John. We don't really have anything more from what happens here from John's perspective with respect to the apostles. Jesus is about to leave his disciples. He had told them in John 16, I'm about to leave. I'm about to depart from this earth. So what does this mean that Jesus says, you follow me? For Peter and the other 11 disciples, what it's meant has been a literal, physical walking and following Jesus down paths and roads, into homes and into cities, on the boat and up into the mountainside. They have physically followed Jesus. But what does it mean now? Jesus had instructed his disciples in John 15 to abide in him. And that to remain or to abide with him was to abide in his word, John 15, verse 7. And that if they abided with him, his words would abide in them. And so, in a sense, then, to follow Jesus is to abide, is to remain, to follow the word that he has given. He prayed in John 17, Father, I've given them everything that you've instructed me to say. And so these words, I'm praying that they will abide in them because your word is truth. So sanctify them by this truth. So in one sense, then, the words of Jesus, we need them so that we might follow him. If we are not in this word, then how can we be following him? We need to know what he says. We need to be reminded of what he says. But there is more than just a knowledge. When Jesus says, you follow me, I'm giving you my word. I'm giving you these instructions on how you trust me, how you live for me, how you look to me alone. There's also this sense that Jesus has here when he says, you follow me. He has this idea of you also follow my example. You imitate me. Now, any good teacher knows that it's not just the conveyance of information that's important, but the example of that information and how one handles it. Jesus' disciples, they had walked with him for 3 years. They had seen how he handled unique and difficult situations. They saw how he cared for the brash Pharisee, which was very different than the sick woman. They saw how he treated an immoral person who was full of a debauched lifestyle versus someone who was very religious. And they learned the pastoral sensitivities as Jesus diagnoses by asking questions and applying each situation, the truths which are absolutely true, but unique to that individual's circumstances, their weaknesses, their sufferings, their sins. And like a good apprentice who follows their master, they watch, they learn, they study not just the words, but the methods and the style and all of the other aspects that come that are not just contained in the impartation of knowledge. You don't become a great welder by reading a book about it. You watch, you learn, you practice. You become a good carpenter by learning how to put all the boards together in the right way to frame up a building and to attach it and fasten it and make sure everything's level. You learn how to grow in skills by both watching and doing. And Jesus has done this. He's done this by showing his disciples how he handles the weak and the brokenhearted. He's shown his disciples how he handles a tender situation versus a brash situation. And in this, the call of Jesus to follow him, it is not only a unique following for each one of us that will align us together, but it is also a following that orients ourselves to others. That this following of Jesus, as much as he calls you individually, he also calls you so that there is a collective benefit. That as you follow him, as you learn from his ways, that you apply that. The temptation is that we will try to apply these types of circumstances so that we can replicate the success of someone else. And whenever we think that we can replicate someone else's success by doing it in the same way, we are getting ourselves into a dangerous position of comparavirus, where we can be infected. And when the circumstances then don't work out for our situation the way that other person's situation did, we can question the goodness of God. We can question the justice in the universe. We can question, we can even become bitter and envious and despise those who have success when we have done the exact same thing. The cure for this is for us to follow Jesus on the unique path that he has for you and me, that together we're aligning ourselves, using our unique gifts, our unique abilities, our unique strengths, so that we might serve one another in love. I love one of the prayers of A.W. Tozer. In his book, The Price of Neglect, it's several of his essays that he wrote when he was pastoring in the Christian Missionary Alliance. They were gathered together, and he had a prayer that I have printed up and I have kept on a bulletin board in my church study. I look at it quite often because I need this reminder. Tozer was a great man of God. He was a man who had deep intimacy with God. He seemed to relish this communion with God in a way that so many, they still find it pulses and resonates with them when they read his works. Tozer prayed, "Dear Lord, I refuse henceforth to compete with any of thy servants. They have congregations larger than mine, so be it. I rejoice in their success. They have gifts greater than mine. Very well, that is not in their power nor in mine. I am humbly grateful for their greater gifts and my smaller ones. I only pray that I may use my gifts to thy glory, as modest as they are. I will not compare myself with any, nor try to build up my self-esteem by noting where I may excel one or another in your holy work. I herewith make a blanket disavowal of all intrinsic worth. I am but an unprofitable servant. I gladly go to the foot of the cross and own myself the least of thy people. If I err in my self-judgment and actually underestimate myself, I do not want to know it. I purpose to pray for others and to rejoice in their prosperity as if it were my own. And indeed, it is my own if it is thine own. For what is thine is mine. And while one plants and another waters, it is thou alone that giveth the increase."